Hi everyone, and welcome to our week where we are going to start talking about how to write a literature review. Okay, so for this lecture, it's going to be pretty brief. We're going to talk about the literature review broadly. I'm going to show you some example structures that you can sometimes see in literature reviews, and then we are going to talk about where to find scholarship. Okay. Now, I want you to watch this video before you go into Jaleesa Kenyon's videos on finding sources in the library, because I think this one sort of shifts pretty naturally into how to find sources with her. So the big picture, this is a typical research article structure. You can see the abstract, which is like a one-paragraph summary of the whole paper. You have an introduction. I don't need you to write that just yet. You have a literature review, which is what we're focusing on this week and next week. You have methods, results, discussion, and conclusion, right? So this is just a general layout. But I want to just talk really quickly here about the literature review. You'll notice that this is sort of like a cone, right, or a funnel. And what you are doing with the literature review is setting it up to where the beginning can be sort of broad in some respects, but it slowly narrows or funnels more into what you are going to be arguing, what you are going to be positing in your paper, okay? Now, the big picture here is, I don't know if any of you are old enough, but there were these books in the 90s, these like mystery books where a cat solves mysteries. It's adorable. In any case, I want you to think of this literature review like a mystery, right? You are trying to find other clues from previous detectives that are going to help you solve the mystery, right? You're going to be looking for previous scholarship on the matter and seeing what they find, okay? You are not going to discuss like every single piece that you've ever found about this specific mystery, this specific research question. You are only going to want to choose the ones that are closest to your question and closest to your theory. So if you have a question on like, why do some people vote for Republicans and some people vote for Democrats? And then you go into all of the possible reasons that that is possible, like based off of scholarship, that's too broad, right? You want to be choosing ones that are the closest to the question and argument that you are going to be making, okay? So again, you want to choose selectively which pieces you include in your literature review, okay? Now, the general layout of a literature review is you are trying to find at least two camps, maybe even 3 or 4, not more than 4 though, okay? For this project, you should not have more than 4 camps, okay? But you should have more than 1. Okay, and each camp is going to have at least 2 pieces of scholarship in it. If you can only find one that sort of proves a point or illustrates a point, some kind of relationship, that's probably not enough to label it as a camp, right? Camp suggests that there's more than one there. Okay. Now you tell the reader at the beginning of each paragraph what those pieces of scholarship have in common. That's what makes them a camp. Okay. If you have taken an English class or a rhetoric and composition class, we would call those a topic sentence, right? And it's a good signpost to give for the rest of the paragraph, right? If you're going to tell me these scholars find that voter ID laws have no effect on turnout, right? That's a great signpost. I have a sense of what scholarship is coming in the next paragraph. And I advise you to do the same here. This is what readers are looking for, okay? And really, this is not an annotated bibliography, okay? If this were an annotated bibliography, you would have one paragraph for each article, summarizing it for a total of 8 paragraphs. No. Instead, you are looking for things in common among the sources that you find, okay? So ask yourselves, what do these writers or detectives have in common? Now, the general layout of literature reviews, it sort of depends on your question. So as a reminder, right, you should either have a why question, which includes just the dependent variable, or you have a what effect question, which includes both the independent and dependent variables. I'm going to show you a few example layouts. but you don't necessarily need to adhere to those strictly. You don't need to like definitely fall into them, but I do want to show you what some layouts can potentially be. So if you have a why question and you have no idea what independent variable you want to focus on, then your literature review is likely going to have that triple IE framing. So for example, why do some states have higher turnout than others, right? That's a why question. And your first paragraph or section is going to be interests. Benefits outweigh the costs. Remember, the triple IE framing is from Baglioni. Section 2, institutions. Some states make it easier than others. And then section 3, identities. Some groups have historically higher or lower participation. Okay. But in any case, right, the first camp is interests, the second camp is institutions, and the third camp is identities, right? And you're going to find 2 to 3 sources for each and discuss them accordingly. Okay. Now, if you have a what effect question and you know what your independent variable is, you know what your dependent variable is, but nobody else has studied the 2 of them together before, or nobody has looked at what this independent variable's effects on your dependent variable are, then your literature review can also have that triple IE framing. Again, this is not definitely what you need to do, but it is a possibility. Okay, I do want to frame this as like, this is a possibility for you to do, though I will say by the time you get up into senior capstone, this is a little less common for students to use. In fact, very few students would do the triple IE framing in capstone. So an example here is what effect do driving rates have on the implementation of motor voter. So motor voter, if you're at all familiar, this is a law from passed at the federal government in the 1990s that allowed for individuals to register to vote when they got their driver's license, motor voter. Okay, and so it is largely thought that it improved voter registration in the short and long term. Okay, and we would frame this as interests. It lowers the costs of voting, right? If you make it pretty easy. Institutions, the rules of motor voter make it easier for people to register. And then identities. Some groups potentially benefited more from motor voter than others. So for instance, maybe the argument you're going to make is drivers, people with cars likely benefited more from motor voter than other groups. Okay. Now, if you know what your independent and dependent variables are, and there is clear disagreement in the field, then your literature review is probably going to walk us through that disagreement. And this is a really common one. Political scientists don't often agree on many things. There are a lot of diverse findings. That's not a bad thing. That's just how science works. But here is an example. What effect do voter ID laws have on turnout? Section 1, it mobilizes, right? That's your first camp. Camp 2, it demobilizes. That means it discourages turnout. And then section 3, it mobilizes some groups in some cases and potentially demobilizes other groups in other cases. Now, the next option is if you know what your independent and dependent variables are and there is clear agreement in the field, then your literature review is probably going to walk us through that consensus, but increasingly hone in on the focus of that question. Okay, so what effect does air pollution have on cardiovascular disease? I'm sure you all know air pollution is bad for your body. I don't think that is a mystery in science. The consensus is quite clear. Air pollution, bad. Okay, so in that case, there's not disagreement like that previous example where some people found that voter ID laws demobilized, another found that it mobilized, or a third camp of sometimes, right? Instead, the effects are quite clear. So instead, we can say like, well, we have this one camp that found that air pollution increased rates of COPD. And then your next camp 2 is the effects of air pollution increase the rates of myocardial infarctions, right? That's a heart attack. And then section 3 is effects of air pollution on strokes, right? So maybe I'm specifically interested in strokes. So I'm narrowing it down to the focus of my question, right? And like, I want to focus on strokes, but I'm showing that there is broad consensus in the scholarship that it has negative effects on these other health outcomes. Now, if you know what your independent and dependent variables are, and you would be the first to pair them together, then your literature review is likely going to walk us through the scholarship on both of these separately. Okay. So for instance, maybe you ask a question like, what effect does union membership have on turnout? Your first paragraph then is going to walk us on the prominent literature on predictors of turnout. So maybe that's race, ethnicity, income, education, right? Like we know that these things predict turnout, but nobody has yet looked at how union membership predicts turnout. And then the next paragraph, or camp 2, is going to tell me like, hey, we do know that union membership affects these other outcomes, right? So maybe it increases the likelihood that you're going to go canvass for a political candidate or you're going to sign a petition, but nobody has yet looked at how being a union member affects voter turnout. Okay, so this is an example where the first camp is looking at this is what we know about predictors of turnout, right? And the second camp is saying we know this independent variable, union membership, affects similar outcomes, but no one yet has looked at union membership and turnout together. Now, where should you look for literature? Where can you find these other detectives' findings? This is not a regular Google search. Just to be clear, if you do a regular Google search, it's going to be problematic for you. These do need to be peer-reviewed scholars, okay? These do need to be peer-reviewed scholars. So if so, this is like the first place that I would recommend going. Okay, I would recommend going to Google Scholar. And what you can see here is I am interested in how politics shapes pet preferences. Who knew? Okay. And so I've typed in pet preferences politics. Pets and politics. Do liberals and conservatives differ in their preferences for cats versus dogs? Right? And I click on it. And I can look through the abstract and I can look through the paper and look, there's a lot of stuff here already in political identity and pet preference. And just like going through some of this research, and there are some citations as well, right? And so when I find a good study, I can pull these citations too and use them for my project, okay? Now, my advice for you is try to find 3 sources on Google. You don't have to send them to me or anything. And read the introduction of those pieces, right? Because the introduction is usually a summary of the whole article. And what do each of those articles examine? What do each of those articles find? And which article felt the most relevant to your research question, okay? Because I want to just quickly pop over to our Canvas page and take you to the assignment. So this is where we are headed. September 28th is when your literature review is going to be due. And you need to consult at least 8 peer-reviewed sources, right? Which is where you can find them in Google Scholar. And Jaleesa's videos are also going to help you find more peer-reviewed sources, but they do need to be peer-reviewed, okay? This should be in paragraph form and cited with in-text citations. Jaleesa is also going to talk about that a bit this time, like how to do the citations, and I'll talk about it a bit next week as well. And this literature review doesn't just list what other scholars have said about this question, like an annotated bibliography. Remember when we talked about that last week? Instead, you are going to identify and describe debates that researchers have had and where you find common themes, right? Those camps or schools of thought. In other words, you're going to find common themes among these articles and group them according to that theme, right? And then discuss your gaps and how your research might fill that gap, okay? So look, consultation of 8 sources, correctly cites using APA, paragraph form, outlines what other scholars have said before, identifies relevant camps or schools of thought, and then you discuss the gaps. And this is also mirrored in the rubric itself, okay? So I just want to put that on your radar. Now, finally, just to briefly revisit where we've been, right? I have given you a sense of where, like, what the literature review is. We've talked about some example structures. You don't need to adhere to those super closely, but just to give you some ideas. And then finally, we talked about where you can find citations, and that's on Google Scholar. So you can just go to Google Scholar and see what has been said before, right, on your research question. And Jaleesa has some good advice here too about using the library databases, but also using those keywords for somewhere like Google Scholar. Okay, but start looking for sources. That's the name of the game this week. Okay. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm pretty available this week. Otherwise, I'm looking forward to your submissions.